Welcome to another episode of The Art of Feminine Negotiation. I'm your host, Cindy Watson, and I am really excited to introduce you today to Dr. Michele Williams. Welcome, Michele. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be on Women of Purpose.
Yeah, and today we're going to be talking about negotiating leadership and boundaries as women. So, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Michele Williams is a professor at the Tippy College of Business. She's a negotiation strategist for women leaders and inclusive leadership specialist. She's been teaching negotiation at top business schools for over 15 years now, and she's the co author of Four Capabilities Leadership Assessment, very relevant to our topic today, and also The Hidden Key to Leading Through Chaos. So, you've got some real expertise today that you're going to be finding out about those key tips that will help you in terms of your leadership as a woman. So, Michele, tell us a little bit about your experience and how you came to do this work.
And that's really an interesting story. When I graduated when I was in undergrad, I had the opportunity to do a internship at Johns Hopkins hospital. So I was at the university, I did it at the hospital, and I was a psychology major. And so I thought I would really start to learn about how teams work well. And I thought, oh, I'll get to sit in on real teams. And what I found is that there were doctors with codified knowledge, there were nurses who knew the patients, there were social workers who knew the family, and there was a great deal of conflict about what was the best course of action for the patient, even though everybody had the goal of the patient getting well and going home. And so that was my first real key, that having the same goal didn't ensure that you could collaborate well. And so really, through my career in academia, I've really been looking at trust and collaboration and boundaries, both, organizational boundaries in terms of, being different consultants and clients, demographic boundaries, people of different ages, gender, and looking at how people can work to make sure that those things don't interrupt trust and collaboration.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And you couldn't have picked a better
And
example. As you know, my daughter had to have open heart surgery at 2 months old. So what you described in terms of everybody having the best interest at heart, but not the pieces just not meshing together, that certainly resonates with me. So I love that. Now, I find women tend to be more likely, and I don't know if this is your experience, but tend to be more likely to shy away from negotiations, generally, I think for a host of reasons, many tied to social conditioning, and even more so in advocating for themselves. So, do you have any sort of advice for women in that category, both for, the general population or people in those leadership positions?
I really do. And one of the things I like to remind women is that women are smart. It's not that they don't, it's not so much that they don't ask, it's that they've learned in the corporate structure that they're in not to ask, right? So they've been getting backlash and told they're too pushy or too greedy or too selfish. And so they learn not to ask.
Yeah.
And then they're disadvantaged by that. And I think that a lot of times women just need to draw on their innate strength and ability to ask. And because you look at when they're negotiating on behalf of others, for their children, for their family, for their community organization, they are tough negotiators. And so going back to setting those really high aspirations in the workplace and realizing that there are ways to ask and negotiation strategies and planning that can really help them be effective. One of my favorite strategies that comes from Amy Cuddy's work on presence is using those strong nonverbals, is that people get more pushback for their language than they do for their nonverbal. So when they come confidently into the room, speak calmly, a lot of times that show of assertiveness is very, very helpful. And then the second thing I have them do is think about themselves as their friend, as if they were their friend, and list all the things they would argue about why this person needs the raise or should have this challenging role. And when they think of it that way, they have that list. And it's really having those arguments, having that confidence in, yes, I've really contributed a lot to this firm, and I've hit these metrics, I've contributed this to the bottom line, I've satisfied these really difficult clients, and being able to have that in mind when they come for the ask.
Yeah, I love that third party approach. Absolutely. I call it the mama bear, where I tell them to invoke the mama bear to advocate for their own little cub. But definitely that thinking of a friend, I think, can be super powerful because we can be, as women, incredibly powerful advocates when we're advocating for others. So obviously the skill set is there. I agree. And I'd love you to go a bit deeper about that, the Amy Cuddy work, because something really resonated as you were saying that, Michelle, that as women in particular, there are certain things when women show up in a particular way, and language, I think, is a big one, or tone of voice, even, we're received very differently than men saying the same things, even in the same tone of voice. So, talk a little bit more, A, about that sort of unconscious gender bias, but also, I love this idea, if you can explore it a little bit more for us about what you meant by those nonverbals.
So that's a really good question. One of the things I meant for the nonverbals is that women often, as they progress in their career, and I have a study on this in the consulting arena, is that what it showed is that when women progressed in their career, they were treated with less interpersonal sensitivity. But as men progress in their career, they're treated with more. And all the work on power says more powerful people are treated with more sensitivity. And it's the flip for women. And so kind of being in that context of realizing that you're going to have to, that the context is different. It's not going to feel as comfortable as when you move up through the further through the ranks, and that the nonverbals that people, and that because of this, women, and I see this with people of color also, you tend to shrink back, right? So they come quietly in the room, they try to keep their head down, do really good work, wait for other people to recognize them. And that strategy, though it is very, it's taught in a lot of cultures, it's particularly taught to women, is not effective because nobody's paying enough attention to you to know what good work you're doing. And so if you're not there to advocate for yourself, it just falls for the wayside. And you're also not seen as leadership material, right? Because you're quiet and you're not kind of getting into those difficult conversation and challenging conversations. And so when I talk about nonverbals, I'm talking about really taking up space. If you watch powerful men walk into a room, they walk in big, they sit down, they spread their legs wide, they spread their stuff all over the table. They just take up a lot of space, right? And that's one of the things that we can do with our bodies, not in the same way, you're still going to sit how you prefer to sit, but just making sure you're not crunching down and you're not just taking notes and you don't look like, that you're just there to take notes, you're there to contribute. Another thing in terms of space is your voice, is talking confidently, right? Women often preface everything with, oh, it's just my opinion, but, right? Like, and these are VPs saying really important things, and they'll still start that way. And I had a VP at Legos that she stopped a meeting and stopped a person who was starting off like that and said, no, this is a good idea. Just, start with your idea. And so sometimes those, it's not quite nonverbal, but that prefacing thing, and you kind of, how you pull in when you say, well, it's just, and the way you lilt your voice when you say, well, I just might think, and really come out and say, yeah, I think this is what we should do. This is the next plan. Our strategy is not working, and say it with a confident voice. So that tone of the kind of the cadence of your voice is going to make a difference, and not asking everything as a question. Maybe we could do, maybe we could try this, as opposed to, I think we should, try that. So those things in your voice, and then in your physical, just making sure you sit tall, you take up space, and you own that space.
Yeah. I love this idea about taking up space because it is so true. And I've seen that, as practicing law for 30 years, men, even with the adjudicator, really encroaching on their space, spreading their stuff out into their space as well. I saw a very funny video on this that really resonated for me. I had a young woman on a subway, and I don't know about you, but taking the subway as well growing up, men are much more likely, as you say, take up that space, push both, physically spread their legs, and we immediately respond by shrinking, right? We're so conditioned to do that. So it had this young gymnast. You don't know that at first. She gets on the subway,
Mhm.
she sits down, and then somebody comes to sit beside her, and she whips her one leg out at a 90-degree angle, and then somebody comes on the other side, whips her other leg. She's in a full splits on the subway. I thought, what a beautiful illustration of us learning to take up space for ourselves. And that waiting to be recognized as well. I'd love you to give a little more tips on that, because I think we are so conditioned as women to, just, as you say, keep your head down, do a good job, be the nurturer, play nice, don't draw attention to yourself. You don't want to be the tall poppy that gets cut
Yeah.
down. And in a work environment, in terms of career catapulting, that just doesn't work. I mean, if you're not advocating yourself and finding those allies, people aren't going to notice the work that you're doing. So, what tips do you have for being able to advocate for that?
So I think part of it is reframing our mindset. And it's really interesting because the mindset in in the US and in Canada and in Western Europe is really of a meritocracy, that you do a good job and it will be rewarded by, I don't know how, but it will just be rewarded, right? And the idea that there are actual social networks in place, that people have sponsors, that there are people speaking up for them in the organization when they're not in the room, that all of these things are really contributing to how people got promoted. And we've got to think about that. And if we start to think about, well, this is really a social process, it's not just my good work, but in addition, it's a social process, then we know that people actually need to know about our good work, right? Those sponsors, the people who would speak up for us if they only knew we had brought in a new client or we had saved the company $4 million, right? Like they need that information.
Yeah.
And so once we think about the process as kind of not quite fully a meritocracy, but having a social element, then it behooves us to actually let people know what our accomplishments are, and these are just facts, and they come up naturally in conversation. And I think what women tend to do is they hold back because they don't want to be bragging. And so in situations where it would be perfectly natural for them to say, oh yes, this was my experience with this client and this is how I landed them, and tell that story, they hold back and they don't tell the story. And so I think that a lot of it is the narrative we start to tell about ourselves and our work. And another piece of that, I think, is the language, is that if we don't tell our own story, other people will tell it for us.
Yeah.
And the story other people tell for women is, oh, they're so nice. They're so good with people. Isn't that fabulous? I'm so glad to have her on my team. Oh, she's so passionate, right?
Yeah.
And so passionate, good with people, nice does not get you promoted. They have nothing to do with leadership.
Yeah.
But when you talk about it in a different language, right? You're nice. What it means is you are able to motivate your team.
Yeah.
You're a good mentor to more junior people. You're able to help departments resolve conflicts. So when you start putting different language to those behaviors, right, you're able to motivate everyone. And that language is language that are leadership skills.
Yes.
And so it's our responsibility, and no, it shouldn't be that way. Everyone should just recognize the good work. But given that they're really focused on themselves, we need to tell a story in the way that lets others know we are leadership material. So they're not using just vague, nondescript language just to describe all the good work that we're doing.
Yeah, that is such great advice. And I know both you and I often speak about the brag list, so I'm so glad you
Yeah.
used the word brag out there as well. So, for all our listeners out there, make sure that you start keeping a brag list of all of those qualities, because when you hold it inside, waiting to get recognized, when the time comes, you're not going to remember all of it. So make sure you're keeping track of all of those things that you're contributing as well. I think that's such great advice. And just before we jump into the leadership qualities, I can't wait to hear, I know you've got such expertise on this, but we've thrown thrown around the terms about sort of sponsors and mentors and allies so far, and I think it's such an important subject. It's worth taking a couple of minutes. So, do you mind just sharing some of your expertise about, what the difference is between a mentor, a sponsor, and ally, and why is it important to be looking for them in the workplace?
That's a great question, and there really is a subtle difference. A lot of times, women and men also go into an organization looking for a mentor, and they're looking for a mentor who will do everything for them.
Yeah.
That mentor will give them advice about their career. They'll probably give them advice about their personal life. They'll love, play sports with them. And that's more than a mentor usually does. A mentor is there to help guide you in that organization and in your career. But then there's a sponsor. And the sponsor is someone who speaks up for you when you're not in the room and says, this is the person. Oh, this opportunity is coming up. This is a great person for the job. They've done this, this, and that. They're the person you should look at. And often we rely on our mentors to do that. And some do, but some don't. And that's often a different set of people. Your sponsors may be people higher up in the organization that you just have lunch with maybe every 6 months and update them on what they're doing. And they just take an interest in your career and what you're contributing to the company. So they might not be the same person that you have the close relationship with that you have with your mentor. And then allies are people who are often overlooked. And those are people who are aligned with you and your ideas and can help you sell your ideas. So when you come into a meeting, you don't want to come into that meeting with the most brilliant idea that no one has ever heard, and they have no idea. And then you say it, and either it falls on deaf ear, nobody picks it up, or someone else picks it up and they're given the credit for that idea, right? And so, which happens a lot.
A lot.
So what you want to do is make sure that you take that idea and you shop it around. You talk to people who you think might be on board. And so when you present in the meeting, you can, there are 3 or 4 people in the room who are going to say, yes, I think that's a good idea. And they have buy-in, they believe in your idea. And that allows you to get other people who might be more on the fence on board because they see that there's a core group who think this is a good direction to go.
Yeah. Beautiful description, as always. I love that. And again, for our listeners out there, really important to know those distinctions and to be looking for all 3 of those, right? Like make sure that you're looking for mentors so that you get some of that hands-on advice that you need to help advance you. Be looking strategically and with intention for those sponsors who are really going to help catapult your career, and also allies, so that on the day-to-day that you're not having your ideas taken by somebody else and appropriated, as Michele said, and so often happens. All 3 of those working together are really going to help catapult you and make that difference. And especially because there are unconscious gender biases out there, I think it's so important to be able to have those allies there who can, sometimes that takes the edge off, those unconscious gender biases, because you're not seen as making yourself too big or larger than life. You've got somebody else there advocating to do that for you. So without further ado, let's get you into the juice of what you see as the hallmarks of a great leader.
So I think one of the things when we talk to leaders and we ask mid-level leaders, what are the skills of leaders? We get a lot of things about vision and about empathy and about empowerment and about relationships. And I think those are all really important. So that relational side is the piece that often people don't focus on enough. Because if you don't have the trust of the people who you're leading, you're not going to get very far, even if you have the best idea and best vision. So that relational side is very important. But one of the pieces that's missing, and I really go back to the 4 capabilities model that was developed at MIT Sloan School of Management, where I used to teach, is that there's a piece of leadership called sense making. And sense making is bringing disparate pieces of information to bring a new picture of the world. And so, for instance, John Reed, when he was the head of Citibank, he looked at the world and he said, we need automatic teller machines, right? There were no automatic teller machines. But he said, we need people to be able to go and do their banking independently at all hours. And that's kind of, and that bringing those pieces of information together, then creating that vision. So visioning is the second piece. So
Yeah.
you have that sense making and that visioning, and then having those interpersonal skills, that trust to be able to keep people going and motivate them. And the last piece is inventing. And inventing is so important, and it's really related to sense making, is when you have that new vision of the world, it is probably not perfectly accurate.
Yeah.
So when we look at, and the best example of that is this pandemic that we've been in,
Yeah.
right? Every time we think we have a handle on exactly what's going to happen in the next 3 months and how it's going to go, nature throws us a curveball.
Yeah.
And it's different, and we have to rethink. And so the inventing part is doing these small tests, being able to get this picture and do a test and see if that works, and whether it succeeds or fails, really looking at the idea that we're learning, that our ability to test these models and to do experiments is to learn. So if you learn that nobody wants to buy your product,
Yeah.
that's information, and you go back to the drawing board. And if you learn that, wow, this is, I can't even produce enough of this
Yeah.
because people love it, it's also information. And I think that in entrepreneurship, we are very much in touch with that we have to do that iteration. But in corporate world, we get to the point where we're always looking over our shoulder not to fail. We think someone else is going to move
Yes.
into our spot. And so we don't do that testing. And so as a leader, if we can create that psychological safety and we can create an environment where people can do these small experiments, and that failure is looked at as a positive, as, okay, what did we learn? That allows us to really be innovative in our corporation. And one of the people who's a big fan of this type of sense making was the head of Microsoft.
Yeah.
And when he came into Microsoft, he did something that was very unusual. At their top leadership meeting, he brought in the CEOs of all the companies they had acquired to
Yeah.
talk to the leadership team and talk about their perspective, because those startups have very different perspectives. It's information that needed to be incorporated at the top of at the top of Microsoft. And so that's the type of leadership that's very important. And I think, not ironically, but interestingly, it's a type that fits very well with women's style of leading,
Yeah.
right? Because they're very collaborative. So they're including more voices. They're getting all that information to look at things in a new way. And so when I talk to women, one of the things I think is so important is, I would get the article to be able to show your bosses and your organization, I am leading. When
Yeah.
I'm bringing people together and coming up with a new way of doing something and doing these experiments, this is leadership, right? I was working with a woman who was starting to do drug trials, and in a more diverse group of people, right? So being able to figure out how to do that and do that well requires sense making. There's no roadmap, right?
Yeah.
Because it hasn't been done before.
Yeah, I love that. So why don't we, I think this is super important. So what, can you give us the recap again? What are these four capabilities, just so that, and then we can break
Oh,
down,
sure.
because I think it's important for the women out there who are listening as leaders to really make that connection. Here are the capabilities. Here's how that lines up with what would be my natural sort of feminine intuitive strengths, right? So give it to us
Exactly.
again.
So, so the first one is sense making, and that's bringing people together to get that new map of the world. The second is relating. So all those skills that you have of empathy and trust building, and communication skills, critical. And a lot of times those skills are mentioned as being nice. Those aren't being nice. Those are your relationship. Those are your relationship skills that are critical to
Yeah.
leading. The third one is vision. Once you have, that new map of the world, creating a vision that you can get people on board with,
Yeah.
right? So you're using those relating skills to get people on board. So we have sense making, relating, visioning, and then inventing,
Yeah.
making sure that you're willing to make small tests and get that information, and that failing isn't we don't want to fail in big ways. Failing is one of those ways that we gather information. There's this classic story, and I don't even know where it comes from, that a top management person, lost $5 million of the firm on this thing that they tried. And, he wrote out his resignation and went into the CEO and said, I know I've lost this money. I've learned, it was a terrible mistake. And he hands in his resignation, and the CEO goes, I'm not accepting that. I've just spent $5 million on you. You go and figure out what to do. Right. And so and that we all need to think about that. Those mistakes, even if they're expensive, those are learning experiences and put us in the position to do fabulous things.
Yeah. I'm so glad you touched on that idea of reframing failure. It is so important. I mean, there is no success typically without being able to go through those so-called failures. And so
Oh,
long as you
definitely.
learn from them, that's a great story. I just love that as well. And, a friend of mine had coined that failabrations, which I use all the time. Start celebrating those failures so long as you're learning from them. I just love that. And that psychological safety piece. So often ignored. I know Google had, I think it was Google, had done a study, and psychological safety was the number one factor tied to productivity and success and performance in organizations. When people felt that psychological safety to be able to make those mistakes, to have those failures, and to learn from them and step up and show up. And again, I think that is one area where women can really shine as leaders. And it struck me,
Definitely.
Michelle, when you talked about these, as you were going through the four capabilities and all of the sort of subset that fall under each of those, it sounds like a lot of these are the same traits that would make for a great negotiator. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I use these exactly in that, and I have a negotiation program called Leading Negotiation that uses these four capabilities because, for instance, sense making, you're trying to make sense of the lay of the land to make those creative win-win solutions. That's part of figuring out those options, bringing in different information, and really listening in a deep way to get more information. And then the relating and the building trust is one of those ways that you can get more information from other people, right? People
Yeah.
aren't going to share information. You're not going to create that win-win if you don't have that relationship. And and I think that as leaders, we need to create a vision for our negotiation. Where could we potentially get? What are the potential benefits
Yeah.
of this situation? And we're framing it for the other people, because a lot of times people are coming into a negotiation in a real win-lose competitive mindset. And that vision for what we can produce is what can kind of transform the way we share information and the way we get to the outcome. And then the inventing and those little tests, I think we do that all the time in negotiation, right? So the idea of presenting multiple simultaneous offers, we're testing what will work, right, for this situation. And that's really important. And also, if we think of contingency contracts, we're testing. We're saying, well,
Yeah.
I think this is the way it's going to go, but
Yeah.
I granted I might be wrong.
Yeah.
So this is the contingency. If I can make X deadline, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is what's going to be the bonus. But if I don't, this is what's going to happen. So that we're covered. If you don't believe I can make the deadline and I believe I do, we can trade off on that difference
Yeah.
and kind of take this contract as an experiment, and we'll see which one goes, and we'll both be happy with either outcome.
Yeah, some great perspectives there, Dr. Michelle. I love that. Thank you. And what would you suggest for women? What are some ways that maybe they can get a little more intentional about bringing these four capabilities to the forefront in assuming that leadership role and also getting credit for them?
I think that's a really good question. And I think that we need to be reflective and we need to ask for feedback, right? So sometimes I have people do 360-degree assessments, or just actually ask people what, do ask their employees and their subordinates and their bosses. And so what we found, we did a large 360 study on over 1,000 mid-level managers. And what we found, one thing that we found that was really interesting is that your subordinates have as good an opinion,
Yeah.
they're highly correlated. When they look at how successful you are and if you're meeting those metrics for your organization, they are as good at assessing that as your boss is,
I
because
love it.
they know what's going on. And so we often, that's a huge source of information that's really comfortable to, ask our
Yeah.
subordinates. And we don't take advantage of that.
Yeah.
The other thing to think about is that when we're using sense making and we're using perspective taking and looking at things from other people's point of view, those lead to other skills like like our credibility and our visioning. And so they're often hidden. So when you're working on that set of skills, you're not going to see, people going, oh, wow, you're such a great sense maker, right? They're going to say, wow, you have great vision, right? They're going to see the outcomes of it. They're
Yeah.
not going to necessarily see the process.
Yeah.
So sometimes people stop working on those processes because they're less visible, but they are the things that lead to those positive outcomes. So I would definitely, keep doing that. And then, looking at and then getting feedback from below you and above you in your organization.
Yeah. And so important that you said about getting that feedback from the people who are doing the work. Because as a labor lawyer for 30 years, it just used to baffle my mind that you have the workers who are on the floor, grassroots out there, and they never, very few managers ever sought input from them about how they could make the organization better, how the structure could be streamlined, where the efficiencies were. And there's a wealth of information sitting there from the people who are at the front line. So I
Oh,
love
definitely.
that you raise that. So important. And also, I love this idea, and I would just piggyback on when you had said about these four capabilities. For our listeners out there, get really intentional about them. This is an episode you're going to want to go back, re-listen to it again. Jot down notes for yourself. Here are these four capabilities that make and mark for the really effective leadership, and then get intentional about, okay, what are ways that I can make this show up? And I'd be interested in your thoughts, Michele, because for me, one of the things that prompted me to really sort of push with this art of feminine negotiation, as I call it, or yours, for those out there, Michele has a fabulous program called Negotiation for Nice People, which I just love. But I think for so long, we define success based on that more masculine model. And I think both men and women started seeing some of these skills as being a liability, right? That they weren't a sign of great leadership. And so they stopped buying into them. So I'd be interested on your perspective on that. Do you see a shift where we're now starting to recognize these qualities as actually being strengths and not liabilities, and something that we need to embrace as opposed to stifle? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think that definitely as organizations are becoming flatter and needing to be more agile and flexible, we're seeing that things like empowering leadership, um, making sure that not only do you have all of these skills, but you're developing these skills in your subordinates and in your frontline workers. Like it is, you can be the best sense maker, but you need everyone in your organization doing that same thing so that they can bring you suggestions for different experiments to do or different ideas. And so it's not just listening to them, but making sure that they have the skills and that this is rewarded, that things like sense making are rewarded for promotion. They're not just a nice to have. And so when we think about those, um, I think we're redefining kind of what good leadership is. So empowering leadership, really, empowering the people below you has been very effective for both men and women. It's been shown to really get people engaged, and it's much more a feminine style of leadership. But we still see that there are those biases or gender expectations in the organization. So when we talk about empowering leadership, that is actually more effective in getting employees to identify with you as a leader for women than it is for men. So it's positive for both and leads to positive outcomes for both. But because there's that compatibility with gender-based expectations, women get an extra bump from that.
Yeah.
And so so it is very interesting that we still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
And for instance, when employees are empowered, right? A lot of times it is harder for female employees to take advantage of that empowerment because they still have other people in the organization pushing back on them. Who do you think you are? Why are you taking charge of that? Isn't that, a manager's role? And so I think that we're definitely seeing that these types of leadership behaviors are most effective in allowing us to be flexible and agile, but I still think there's some work to do in our gender expectations.
Absolutely. And speaking of gender expectations, only if you're comfortable sharing, but what if any, have you had any experience of that, either unconscious or conscious, frankly, gender bias at play, whether in your career as in academia or out there in your coaching, in the real world?
So I think that part of why I developed this negotiation for nice people is that once people get that nice, so I was often described as, oh, you're such a nice person. That nice person label is really, I say that there's steps to it, right? So I say when you start off your career as a young female employee, when people say you're nice, it's kind of a compliment.
Yeah.
It's it's like, oh, great, that you're nice. When you get a little higher in the organization, when people say you're nice, what that means is you're not leadership material, right? And because leaders aren't nice, leaders are powerful and agentic, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you make it past that level to the higher levels of your organization, if people say you're nice, what they're saying is, please don't point out the gender biases and the things that are going on, the problems in our organization. You're too nice to do that. Now you're right. So nice has a lot of meanings. It's so I always like to try to unpack that. And I think that's really something that women fight against, because when you're labeled as nice, you're actually given a lot of non-promotable tasks to do, all those nice tasks. So you're on the diversity recruiting committee for the next CEO, or you're doing you're speaking at all kinds of opportunities where the organization wants to clearly show that they're promoting women or things like that, and being able to pull back from that and negotiate those things as part of your promotable tasks.
Yeah.
Right? Because if those things are important enough for your organization to want you to do, they have to be incorporated in your promotable tasks. And on the other hand, if they're not, you have to make that decision on what to say no to. So that's been a real big push in my coaching work too, is working on how do you say no in a polite way that keeps you focused on your goals. Because what I find is high performing women are asked to do so much, and in saying yes to all of these things, it actually detracts from their ability to perform in their core core
Absolutely.
promotable work.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to be so nice that you then are dragged away from that promotion path that you are so passionate about.
Well, let's dig into that, because I think you've just hit on a really important issue, and it ties so beautifully back when you were speaking earlier about women using those qualifiers when we speak, right? That importance of language where we like, oh, it's just this, or, I'm sorry to interrupt, but, I have this very tentative, all of these qualifiers when we're going to broach an idea. And in the same way, I think that fear of no and saying no is one of these other areas where language matters. So, what advice do you have? What are some ways that women, as they're stepping into those leadership roles, can start saying no and setting those boundaries in ways that are going to be acceptable?
So fabulous question again. I think the biggest, and I'm going to go back to something that we talk about all the time, Cindy, is mindset.
Yeah.
Is critical, right? If you think saying no is a bad thing, it's much harder to say no, right? If you think of saying no, one, it's part of a leader's job. Saying no gives to a task, gives other people opportunity to do that, gives other people potential visibility and connection to new networks. That when you're saying no may enable you to meet an important deadline. And so that saying no is something that you're doing to create value for yourself and others. It's not something you're doing to try to derail someone else. And once we start thinking of it that way, then we can figure out, well, how do we do this? And I think that the most important thing is that people often try to adopt other people's no's.
Yeah.
Right. So some people will say no is a full sentence, just say no and
Yeah.
walk away. And that may work for you,
Yeah.
right? Because it obviously works for some people. But for you, it may work to say, thank you so much. That's a great opportunity. It doesn't fit into my schedule for this month. I might be able to do next month, or it's not going to fit into my priorities. For this year, I've made goals, right? Like, so if you've made a goal where if you've set um, kind of a direction where, for instance, you were going to invest all of your money in one charity, and then the other charity asks you, it doesn't mean that that other charity isn't good, but this year I'm donating all my money to St. Jude's, or, whichever charity you choose. And it's easy to say no because you've made a decision.
Yeah.
And so part of that, writing down what are your goals, what are your passions, and what are your values, and then making boundaries around those things, right? So it may be, so I do a lot of talks, and for every 10 talks, right, I will do 2 pro bono talks. And because I have set that out as a metric, it's very clear to say to someone, please apply again next year. I don't have any more pro bono spots open for this year. And as a lawyer, you probably do the same. You have some metric on
Yeah.
what pro bono. You don't just oh gosh, I didn't make any money this year because all my work was pro bono, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this may tie to what you were just saying, or maybe it'll be a different answer because I love that. I'm a big believer, as you know as well, about that mindset and those reframing for ourselves. What role do you think preparation plays in effective negotiation? And more importantly, I guess, what do you think are the most important elements of preparation? Would you say it's mindset or something else?
In terms of saying no, I think one of the most important aspects in terms of preparation is having those goals and set out, right? Having your goals and your values, and then making sure that you have a lot of phrases that give you the space
Mm,
to say no, right? So when someone asks you something, I think what happens is we say yes. We're a nice person. We say yes right away. And then we only realize later that that was a bad idea, right? So we resent it. We're overworked. We're not sleeping. We're
yeah.
not managing our health well. And so whenever someone asks you something, so I always say start with no. Whenever someone asks you something, the answer is no. And it can't be, and obviously it may be your boss. You can't just say no. I'm not even going to think about it. But the no is often just a delay. It's wow, that's a great idea. Let's make a meeting and talk about that next week. Or let's have lunch on Thursday to talk about it.
Yeah.
It's just giving yourself enough time to think and plan, to figure out, does it fit within your schedule? Do you have to say an absolute no to this? Or have they just asked you in a way that's most convenient for them?
Yeah.
Right. And so with a few tweaks, it would be something you'd be happy to do. It would be really beneficial to you, but you can't do it. It could be something as simple as you can't do it on Thursday because that means you have to stay up all night to plan. But if you did it next Monday,
Yeah.
you could do it. You could do the planning on Sunday, and that would be a great opportunity for you. And a lot of times that allows you to either negotiate, and then if you have to walk away, you know why you're walking away,
Yeah.
because it doesn't fit with your capacity at the moment.
I love that. So give yourself space so that you've got, start with the mindset that it's a no, and then give yourself space to be able to do that. And also, I hear you saying, use language that is, I would love to, and maybe next time because of X, Y, Z. Any other sort of language tricks that you would?
So I would also make sure that if it's the next time, you've thought about that, right? Because sometimes you're just
Good advice.
kind of trying to use a soft no. I think you have to use an absolute no when you really are not going to do that, right? Like
Right.
if, because I've had talks where, yes, I've ended up postponing it for maybe a couple of years because it didn't fit in, but then it was something I wanted to do. And so we just kept touching base every, September to see if it would fit in that year. And that's fine. But you don't want someone to maintain your integrity. You don't want someone touching base with you again in 6 months when you
Yeah.
didn't want to do it today and you're not going to want to do it in 6 months. Then you have to really say thank you for the opportunity. That doesn't fit in with my priorities right now. I'm not going to be able to do it. Here are some other people. And remember that when you're saying no to a request,
Yeah.
it's not saying that you're not going to help the person, right? So you might find another speaker, you might find another colleague who can help them on this special project. You might be giving an opportunity to someone else. And so thinking about it, like, you can also say, I can't do this, but let's sit down and have coffee and try to brainstorm how we could get this done. What other options you might have for accomplishing this important task. And, just our regular negotiation. This is problem solving. I'm not going to do it, but I still think I can help you figure out how to do it better than maybe you could do on your own, because two heads are better than one.
Yeah. And I love that integrity piece because that is so important, right? Because
Yeah.
as you were speaking, it really struck me. It's like that totally inauthentic when you see somebody that you haven't seen in ages, and there's good reason for that, and you have no intention, and you're like, oh, we'll have to get together for lunch. I'll
Yeah.
call you.
Sometime.
If that's not authentic,
Yeah.
I think that's really important. So I love that. Set those hard no's and find a way to do it that's consistent and in integrity in the sense of there's sort of two senses of the word. One is the moral, and the other is from the Latin integer, about to be made whole. So to be whole with yourself, to be authentic with yourself, you need to be able to set those boundaries. I love that. And also just remembering, I think one of the easy ways is every time you say no to something, you're opening the door for another yes for yourself. And the opposite is also true. Every time you're saying yes to something that you don't really want to do, it means that you're saying no to something else. I think that can
Yeah.
be a great reminder. So do you have any advice or hot tips for how to deal with bullies or people with more power than you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I usually recommend that people first, that kind of pause is first take that space to regroup.
Yes. Yeah,
Because
great advice.
because usually in that moment you're not expecting the harshness of the response that you're getting.
Yeah.
And so even if you can only take a few minutes to go to the bathroom and come back, take that space. And then I really recommend trying to start with some, kind of making sure you name the behavior. So if they're, being yelling or something like that, name that behavior, but then also trying to ask some questions to get their perspective, because a lot of times people seem to be coming at you aggressively and they're coming from a place of pain, or they've misinterpreted something that you've done, and that sometimes getting that discussion back on track is easier than you think when you start to see how they're perceiving your behavior. I always tell this story. I don't know where it started, but it's about this man. He comes home and he's had, so it's a little bit of a gender story, but I'll tell it anyway. He comes home after having traveled and been on a business trip, and he says to his wife, "Oh, let me," then they have several kids. He says, "Oh, let me help you clean up the house," right? And so he's thinking, I've come home from this trip, I'm being so nice. And what she's hearing is, you're not a good wife, you're not a good mother, you can't keep the house clean. And, she doesn't respond well, right? But, starting to understand what the other person's hearing
Yeah.
versus what you're intending to say, and taking some, and feeling like, it's okay to take responsibility for that. You don't have to be defensive. It's not that you said the thing they're hearing. It's that that's the start to a conversation about, okay, how are we going to mention these kinds of things? Because, right, you probably do want my help, but how how are we going to navigate that in a way that doesn't bring this up for you, or that the genuineness of my statement.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great story, great example as well. And because our reality is the meaning that we attach to our thoughts. So that was so
Exactly.
perfectly illustrates that, right? One intention and a different meaning attached that takes us in a whole other direction. So, what do you think are some of the key reasons that either negotiations fail or that leaders end up failing?
That's a really nice question to tease apart. And I think that when we kind of think about negotiation, there's three different approaches to why negotiations fail. And I'll tell you each of them, and then I'll tell you which one I ascribe
Okay.
to more. So the first one is really psychological biases, that negotiations fail because we have biases that prevent us from optimizing our outcomes, right? So if someone anchors us high on a house, we pay too much for it because we're not able to adjust, and all those types of biases. And so the key to negotiation is then guarding against the biases we might have, the psychological biases we might have, just because we're limited information processors. The second is kind of the problem solving approach with saying negotiations fail because we fail to see our compatible interests. So if we had better communication and we were more trusting and willing to share, we could see where we're compatible and we could come to a solution. And the third is really kind of a social construction perspective, that negotiations fail because we don't build, because we don't understand the relational context within which we're working. And so, for instance, when I talked about giving your ideas at a meeting, we don't see them earlier because we don't realize that people are more comfortable if they've heard an idea before, and that we have to do some work behind the scenes to really make that negotiation go well.
Yeah.
And so my perspective is all three of those can contribute to your negotiation failure, and different ones contribute at different times. When I think about leaders, a lot of times it's that social element, that they're so focused on their metrics
Yeah.
that they're both blind to their biases, and they're not seeing things as problems we can solve together. They're just, they start to be reactive and just like, do it this way, do it my way, we've got to get it done, I've got to meet my metrics. And if they're able to step back and be more mindful, they're able to integrate those other aspects of communicating with people.
Yeah, beautiful answer. My goodness. People would think we rehearsed that. That I blindsided with her with that, just so you know. That's how much she knows her stuff. She was able to give such a brilliant answer. I love that. And I really love, Michelle, that you also talked about that in the second of those, about that sharing of information. Because, you know, again, as you can imagine, as a labor lawyer for 30 years with trade union and management in those negotiations, my gosh, there was such a level of distrust often. And you know, they have grievance procedures where they'd have at least 3 opportunities going up the food chain with people on both sides, both with up the union food chain as well as up the management food chain, to be meeting at these higher and higher levels to try and come up with solutions. And invariably, the grievance procedure doesn't work because both parties are so worried about holding everything close to their chest that there's no sharing, there's no collaboration. And I think in my work in negotiating coaching, and I'm sure you've seen this too, when we come from that competitive mindset, when we come from a win-lose mindset, from a scarcity mindset, people are much less likely to share. And if you're not sharing and looking for those collaborative sort of opportunities, things can fall apart quickly. Has that been your experience as well, Michelle, would you say?
Definitely. And I think of it, what one term we use in organizational behavior is information hoarding.
Yes, love
And
it.
you know, and you and that information sometimes is only actually useful if it's shared and other people can build on it and you can do something with it. So I think of it as the beginning of the pandemic when everyone was hoarding toilet paper, right?
Oh,
There's only but so much toilet paper you can use. It wasn't very useful. And information hoarding has the same, you know, yes, you know, information is good, but if you don't share it, you can't build on it. And one of the things I have did a workshop for the Harvard program on negotiation um, about with a labor and management, where they were both together in this course. And one of the things was, well, that was great, is that we talked about this kind of brainstorming options and writing different pieces, like, oh, we could pay 10% of the healthcare, and each group had to do it separately, and then they had to bring it together. And there was so much distrust that people didn't want to bring their two
no.
sheets together. And we had to keep saying that when you do this, you have to do it, that none of the things you've written down are something you're agreeing to.
Yeah.
It's simply information and possibilities and opportunities that you see might be there. And if you combine them, you might actually work together. And so I believe that sometimes when there's such distrust in an organization or so much information hoarding, that a facilitator is very helpful.
Yeah.
Having someone like you come in and talk to both sides and kind of get them to trust that you will make sure that everyone abides by those rules, that these are not agreements, these are just
Yeah.
ideas that we're talking about.
Yeah. And the beauty of sharing is sometimes there are other opportunities. You know, I often say if I come looking for this and you think you're coming looking for that, when we share information, suddenly these new opportunities come where, oh my gosh, that's your priority. I can give you that and more so long as I get this. And you end up with much better holistic agreements for everybody in a way that you wouldn't have gotten to had you not shared that information. So, and I'm just looking at the time. I can't believe how quickly this has gone. We're going to have to get you back here for a part two on another specific area. Some amazing tips. And I normally end off asking as well, what would you say is one of the greatest mindset shifts you've ever had? It can be about leadership or negotiation, or it can be completely unrelated to that. What would you say is one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had, Michele?
I think one of the greatest mindset shifts I had happened back in about 2012. I got really sick, and I kind of asked myself the question: is this, if I can't continue to do this work, or if I can only do it for another year, do I want to,
Yeah.
do it? And I said to myself, yes, but I want to do it my way. I want to do it in a way that addresses gender and addresses equality. And so it totally shifted my mindset. And I love so much what I'm doing because I can speak much more freely and bring in different perspectives that I think I felt more constrained to do before.
Yeah.
And so my biggest mindset shift, I think, was just to be authentic in what you care about and what you want to bring to the world.
That is gorgeous. And for everybody listening, I mean, I really encourage you to adopt that mindset shift without waiting. And thank you for sharing that. I love that. I didn't realize that you'd been ill. And I think we so often wait for some crises in our life before we really tune into what we are passionate about and fill our purpose. So why not choose that every day? Today, it's a gorgeous shift. Thank you for sharing that. And I understand you have some potentially some free gifts for our listeners out there. Why don't you tell us about those, Michele?
Oh, certainly. So one is the Leading Through Chaos Leadership Survey. And so that you can just go to my website, drmichelewilliams.com, and there'll be take the quiz. And that will give you feedback on what is your primary leadership style and where you might want to develop and how all the four of those four capabilities go together. So I really would encourage you to take that. And the second is a start with no cheat sheet. So that's just those four. I have 4 steps to being able to implement saying no more in your life to make the space for the things and the goals and the people that are important to you. And so I think there'll be a link in the show notes. So I recommend that you download that.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you for that. Both helpful. And I'm sure everybody make sure to check out that a cheat sheet on how to say no. You can't go wrong with that as a starting point. So, and I'm going to go in and do your leadership quiz as well. I'd be interested to see how that turns out. And Michele's quite right for everybody there. Please make sure to check out the show notes. I'm going to have that contact information so you can be sure to follow up with Michele at drmichelewilliams.com and check out those resources. So, I'm sure everybody has just got loads of value from this, Michele. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Williams. It has been a pleasure, and really look
Thank you
forward.
for having me.
Yes, just love this. So for everybody out there, if you haven't already subscribed, please make sure to subscribe to the Art of Feminine Negotiation podcast. Make sure to share it with anyone that you think would get value. And make sure to share this episode particularly, because for all of the women in your life that you care about who are looking into how they can up their leadership skills and how they can set those boundaries, you are not going to get better advice than you got here today. So and also make sure to join our Women on Purpose community as well at facebook.com/groups, Women on Purpose community. And that's a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom.